happening? What's happening, folks? Just trying to get the camera appropriately set up here. There we go. Very good. How is everyone doing tonight? Good to see you. Welcome, 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 welcome. Glad to be here with you all. It is a lovely Thursday evening / late afternoon, somewhere in between there. Glad to have the opportunity to engage with all of you. So welcome, glad to be here. If you are new or if you are not new, be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. The way we do things here, the general way that we do things here is that we tend to have me give my opening remarks. Then we have the roll call, and then I answer your super chat questions. So the super chats kind of make the show happen. That's the whole second half of the show, is just me answering your super chats. So if you have a question, if you send me a super chat, I will give you an answer. That's generally the way things work. May not be the answer you want, but if you send a super chat, you will get an answer. We do have unnamed diet beverage. When I open the unnamed diet beverage, it often sounds like I am cocking a gun, but I assure you, it is not a gun. It is merely unnamed diet beverage. So I'm pouring the unnamed diet beverage, and as we get going here, I will be happy to answer your questions. So there you go. Similarities between Browder and Trotsky. That's an interesting one. Browder and Trotsky. Similarities. All righty. So there you go. Lovely times, folks. Lovely times. I just did an interview on the radio show on Sputnik with John Kiriakou and Lee Stranahan. I just did an interview with them. So it was interesting. That's a show on Sputnik Radio. How about that concept of natural rights? Very good. Very good. Natural rights. That's a great super chat question. But anyhow, be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Please tweet this out. Put this on Reddit. Put this on Twitter. Put this everywhere the videos are going. All right, let's jump right into it. Folks, Vladimir Lenin, one of his favorite anecdotes, probably his most favorite anecdote to tell, went like this. There were a group of people walking through the countryside. There was a wide open space in the countryside. Lots of farmland, lots of wide open space, lots of fields. But from a distance, they could see a peasant. And this peasant looked like he was insane. This peasant looked like he was having some kind of epileptic fit, or he was losing his mind. Why? Because his arms were going, his arms were crazy, moving all about. So these people are walking this wide open space. Far away, they see this peasant on a hillside, and he's moving his arms like crazily. And they wonder, is that man losing his mind? Is he imagining that he's directing an imaginary orchestra? What is he doing? What is this peasant who's like moving his arms wildly, vigorously? What is he doing? And they say, this must be a crazy man. This must be a completely delusional, insane man. Look how vigorously he's using his arms. Look, just moving back and forth. It doesn't seem to make any sense. What's going on here? But then the story goes that as the people got closer, they saw that this man, this peasant who was moving his arms crazily, was not having an epileptic fit. He was not moving his arms around erratically. He wasn't directing an invisible orchestra. He wasn't, a madman. He wasn't insane. In fact, his motions had the opposite nature. because this peasant had a knife. And he was sharpening the knife vigorously. And from different angles, he was sharpening the knife. So from a distance, it looked like he was completely insane. But in reality, he was just very vigorously sharpening his knife. And what from a distance looked completely insane and erratic was actually very precise, specific behavior. Think about that. Now, Lenin would tell that story in relation to the Bolshevik Party. That as the Bolsheviks were organizing, they would have splits. They would have political divisions. They would fight among themselves. They would try one tactic, and then the next day they would completely reverse their policy and try something completely different. One day they said this, one day they said that. One day they would work with somebody, the next day they would have a falling out and not work with somebody. And that to a normal observer, the way the Bolsheviks operated looked erratic, looked insane. But in reality, what the Bolsheviks were doing was sharpening their knife and preparing to seize power in Russia. And while it looked insane and deranged from a distance, it was actually very precise, specific action, sharpening their knife and laying the basis for the seizure of power. Very interesting anecdote. Now, from what I understand, Lenin, this didn't happen to him. He wasn't actually walking through the countryside. And he pulled this anecdote from another famous Russian writer, Tolstoy or someone else. But he used it to make the point that often the way revolutionary groups can operate can look crazy, can look deranged, can look insane, but they're doing what needs to be done. In order to sharpen the knife very vigorously, you have to sharpen it very hard. You have to move your arms quite a bit. You have to have different angles. You can't just repeat the same motion over and over again. From a distance, a peasant sharpening a knife looks like he's having a fit, but in reality, he's just trying his hardest to really sharpen that knife. And that was an analogy for how the Bolsheviks operate. And I think about that a lot because sometimes the way our political conversations go and the way those of us who really genuinely want a socialist society in the United States, those of us who really want to get beyond capitalism and get to a new society in the United States of America, sometimes the way we operate can look that way. It can look completely erratic and deranged to an observer. But it serves a purpose. We are trying to sharpen our knives. We are trying to get the job done. We are trying to actually work to establish socialism. But doing that doesn't necessarily involve operating and always marching in a straight line. Now, I missed a couple super chats here. Let me roll back, okay. Taliban. Anti-imperialist. All right, and degrowth. All right. Degrowth. All right. And folks, we are doing our best. Now, there are some of you watching right now who can probably remember when this YouTube channel, when I would hop on here and have a YouTube live, when there would be less than 10 people watching. There'd be less than 20 people watching. But pretty soon, 10 or 20 turned into 60. And pretty soon, 60 turned into 100. And now there is rarely do we have a conversation here on YouTube in which there aren't at least 200 people at some point watching live. Sometimes it gets up to 300. And furthermore, afterwards, there are usually at least 1,000 people who watch us. Most of the time, 2,000. Between 1 and 2,000 people watch these conversations live. Our community has vigorously grown. We have vigorously grown. Vigorously. And we have grown in spite the greatest opposition. There is a war against this YouTube channel and against me in particular being waged. Let's be real about it. There are huge efforts to try and inoculate people against what I have to say. There are people with huge YouTube channels who have made YouTube videos claiming that I am a racist or a sexist, claiming that I get on here doing nothing but ranting against trans people, which is absolutely ridiculous. And they have tried their hardest to keep people that are interested in socialism from listening to what I have to say here and what you all are interested in on here. Look, we on here, we have a conversation about socialism. It's very different than the conversation that generally goes on Left Tube or Bread Tube or left-wing socialist communist YouTube. Generally what happens on YouTube channels by people who call themselves socialists and communists is there is usually someone sitting there with a microphone. They usually have a little microphone. Sometimes they're playing video games while they speak. Sometimes they're just sitting and looking into a laptop with a microphone. And they sit there and they cuss up a storm. And they sit there going, these bleeping corporations are like bleeping, 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 and like bleeping. And they sit there and they cuss, bleeping, bleeping, bleeping. And then they call people Nazi. You know, so-and-so's a bleeping, bleeping fascist, and so-and-so's a bleeping, bleeping Nazi, and so-and-so bleeping, bleeping racist. And they talk about celebrity gossip. Did you see what this bleeping celebrity bleeped out, tweeted yesterday? Oh my God, it's just so awful. And they just sit there and it's this negative, pessimistic, sloppy, adolescent presentation of profanity mixed in with pessimism, mixed in with resentment, mixed in with adolescent sentiments of rebellion. What we do on this YouTube channel is quite a bit different what we do on this YouTube channel. On this YouTube channel, we dig into the history of socialism and communism and Marxism. And we generally engage with the history of the organized political left in the United States. And we are doing our best to engage with how we can get out of the movement, get out of the rut that we're in, get out of the movement and get to the masses. That is our goal, to get out of the movement and get to the masses, to build a socialist movement and an understanding of Marxism and anti-imperialism and socialism that could be accessible to average Americans and to actually transform the United States from being a country at the center of a global imperialist capitalist system to rather being a prosperous socialist society that joins arm in arm with the people of the world in an effort to raise living standards and expand development. That's what we try to do on here. We talk about racism, sure. We talk about gender oppression, sure. We talk about news events that have taken place. Long-term plans to expand CPI. All right. Thanks, Neil Fraser in Hong Kong. All right. Long-term plans to expand CPI beyond USA. We are having a serious conversation. Pro-communist fictional films. We're having a serious conversation here. That's what we're doing. We are having a serious conversation. And we base that conversation on a thorough understanding of historical and dialectical materialism, of the teachings of Marx and Lenin and Mao and Ho Chi Minh and Fidel Castro, as well as the teachings of William Z. Foster and Gus Hall and Huey Newton and Fred Hampton, as well as the teachings of the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Movement, the teachings of Muammar Gaddafi, the teachings of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, the teachings of the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, the teachings of many revolutionary movements around the world. And we take with us the understanding that we should study all of these revolutionary movements, all these revolutionary anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist movements. We should study all of them, but we should blindly follow none of them. That our orientation should be to develop a model that would actually work in this country, to develop a model and a movement for socialism that would have uniquely American characteristics, that would appeal to the broad masses of the American people and result in rescuing our country from the crisis of mass unemployment, mass hunger, mass incarceration, drug addiction, suicide, decaying infrastructure, poverty, pessimism, and replace the society we live in with a society where the banks and the factories and the major industries and the centers of economic power are organized to serve the people and not the profits of a few. And the anarchy of production is eliminated and replaced with a rational system where growth is no longer restrained and living standards can expand to exponential levels. The human life expectancy can go up higher than ever. Poverty can be eradicated. War can be overcome. And we can move toward that ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world based on vast material abundance, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. A world without a government. A world where all can live in prosperity and peace. That is the goal of socialism and communism. That is scientific socialism. And that is the tradition that we represent on these lives. And because we represent that tradition, we sound very different, very, very different, very, very different than other forces. All right, Malthusian anarcho-primitivism. We sound different than other forces, but we're okay with sounding different than other forces. Because at the end of the day, we're not grifters. Folks, you want to talk about grifters, and that's a term that gets used a lot now, grifters. They talk about internet grifters, all these personalities that are online, that are, a lot of them just want to make money. How do you spot a grifter? Now, the way I've talked about that recently is I've said that a grifter is somebody who tells you only what you want to hear, not what you need to hear, right? If you listen to the speeches of Malcolm X, he says that, he often will say in his speeches, he says, I know you don't want to hear this, but he tells his audience what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. A grifter is a panderer. A grifter says what will make him a buck, what'll get him paid. But a serious revolutionary does the opposite. It says what needs to be said, not what is popular. Thoughts on glasnost. Perestroika. Columbia protests. Turn to coup. Now, that is certainly true, but there's more to it than that. COVID conspiracy theories on the left. It's more than that. That's more. Ultimately, the way that you can tell a grifter, the ultimate essence of grifting, is giving up your agency. When left-wing voices, socialist and communist voices, give up the notion that their actions can have any impact, when socialist and communist voices simply become functionaries in a scheme bigger than themselves, they lose their own agenda. They become part of a non-communist, non-socialist, pro-imperialist, pro-capitalist agenda. They become just functionaries in a bigger scheme. They lose their own ability. Obnoxious anarchist. They lose their own ability to impact events. They lose their own agenda. They lose their own center of gravity. They become just another cog in a bigger machine. That is the essence of grifting. The essence, very essence of grifting. A great example of grifting. Years ago, I was in a Marxist group, and the AFL-CIO convention was coming up. Now, the AFL-CIO is the big labor union federation in the United States, run by Democrats. China. New Vanguard. It's run by Democrats. It's not revolutionary, but it is a huge labor federation. And their convention was coming up. They were having their national convention. At this national convention that the AFL-CIO was having, they started to talk a little more left-wing than they had in the past. They were emphasizing, $15 an hour minimum wages, the struggle of low-wage workers. They were talking about some issues like police brutality, etc. And so I remember I went to a communist event where they had a speaker. And this speaker got up and gave a presentation to prep us for this upcoming AFL-CIO convention. And he read some of the statements that these labor leaders had made that were a little more radical. And he read a particular passage from Karl Marx, where Karl Marx said that if labor unions want to be successful, they need to become a center of the entire class, rather than just simply focusing on the narrow needs of the workplace. And that was it. And that was it. That was the presentation. The AFL-CIO, a group that this speaker knew very well was dominated by pro-capitalist elements, was dominated by Democrats, was dominated by anti-communists, was dominated by pro-imperialists. This group was having a convention and rather than talk about why they might be doing this, rather than talk about how actual revolutionaries can relate to it, and how actual revolutionaries can maneuver it, all this communist speaker did was applaud. Right? The social democrats, the reformists, the pro-imperialist labor leaders, they're having a convention, and they're talking a little more left-wing than they used to. Yay! That was it. That was the tone of the entire speech. No talk of exposing them. No talk of how to effectively challenge them and push a revolutionary agenda. No talk of any of that. I listened to the tone of this speech and I filled myself with fury, because the tone of the speech that I was hearing was a tone of, it will just naturally happen. It'll just naturally happen. Look, the labor unions, they're talking more left-wing than they used to. And Karl Marx said in one of his writings that they do need to be centers of the entire class, not just focused on their individual workplace. Hooray. And that is a great example of grifting. Grifting. Absolute grifting. What that person was saying in that speech was, there might be more room for me in the mobilizations that these fake labor leaders are carrying out. There might be more opportunity for me to be used by these phonies and fakes. There might be more opportunities for me. And this individual, the individual in question had given up his agency, largely. And he had just become a grifter, just become a functionary. He wasn't thinking about how to get to socialism. Wasn't thinking about how to dismantle American imperialism. He was thinking about how can I keep my grift going? And his grift was organizing protests, organizing rallies around whatever the latest trendy liberal cause was. All right, Haymarket May Day. Or whatever the latest trendy liberal cause was, that was what he wanted to do. And he was rejoicing that the AFL-CIO was taking a little more of a left-wing tone because it showed that he might be able to maneuver and get more gigs from the AFL-CIO. In Lenin's book, What Is to Be Done, he describes bowing to spontaneity. Bowing to spontaneity. When the workers spontaneously rise up, the communists chase after them, going, "Yay, we agree with you." Lenin says that that's the biggest mistake. The biggest mistake that communists can make is bowing to spontaneity. Lenin, his whole point was that the vanguard should be ahead of the masses, should be leading the masses, not tailing after them, not engaging in tailism and bowing to spontaneity, but instead leading them. Mao's most famous essay, Report on the Investigation of the Hunan Province. It is one of Mao's most important essays. 1927, there is a peasant uprising happening in the Hunan province. Mao goes to the Hunan province to investigate this uprising. He goes to the Hunan province to investigate this uprising, and he writes a paper, a message to the Chinese Communist Party. And luckily, this essay is in We Are City Builders, the Center for Political Innovation educational manual. And so I will just read to you very briefly, I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but I'm going to read you one of the things that Mao said. One of the things that Mao said to the people of the Chinese Communist Party, the members of the Chinese Communist Party, about the uprising going on in the Hunan province. All right. He says, in a very short time, in China's central, southern, and northern provinces, several 100 million peasants will rise like a mighty storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to hold it back. They will smash all the trammels that bind them and rush forward on the road to liberation. They will sweep all the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local tyrants, and evil gentry into their graves. Every revolutionary party and every comrade will be put to the test, to be accepted or rejected as they decide. There are three alternatives: to march at their head and lead them, to trail behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or to stand there in their way and oppose them. Every Chinese is free to choose, but events will force you to make the choice quickly. Right? When the masses are in motion, Mao says you have three choices: to march at their head and lead them, to trail behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or to stand in their way and oppose them. That's how a revolutionary party operates. And this is the essence of the difference between a grifter, between a fake leftist, a phony, and a real revolutionary. If you just bow to spontaneity, if you just tail behind the masses, you're not offering leadership. And when you become a cog in a machine bigger than yourself, when you become a piece of an agenda that is not yours, you've given up the duty of being a revolutionary. Best Soviet Marxist authors. There's nothing wrong with entering an alliance. And this is one of the mistakes that the Trotskyite element will make. They'll say, well, you can't ever vote for a Democrat. You can't ever align with a labor union boss who's not a communist. You can't ever. No, that's wrong. That's wrong. All right? Soviet response to Nagasaki, Hiroshima. That's not correct. You can make an alliance. Look, in 1936, the Communist Party worked very hard to secure the re-election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt was running for office. He was an ally of the labor movement. He was sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And the Communist Party worked very hard to make sure he was re-elected in 1936. And if Roosevelt had not won the election, there's a very good chance we wouldn't have industrial unions, and the good-paying jobs of the 1950s would have never come into being. There's also a very good chance the USA might not have been on the right side in World War II. In 1936, endorsing Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he ran for president was the correct thing to do. 1948, the Communist Party worked very hard to campaign for Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was the vice president of the United States, and when McCarthyism got going, when the Cold War got going, Henry Wallace, he broke with the Democratic Party, and he formed the Progressive Party, and he ran on a platform of opposing Jim Crow segregation, peace and friendship with the Soviet Union, and opposing the Taft-Hartley anti-labor law. Pro-labor, pro-black liberation, anti-Cold War. Henry Wallace wasn't a communist, but on that basis, the Communist Party worked very hard, and millions of people voted for Henry Wallace in the 1948 election, as a way to reject McCarthyism and support the civil rights movement and to support, to oppose the Cold War and to support labor unions. That was the right thing to do. It's not a question of whether you enter an alliance or not. Karl Marx endorsed Abraham Lincoln, for goodness sakes, right? Abraham Lincoln was running for president for re-election in 1864 in the middle of the Civil War. Worst president. Karl Marx campaigned and endorsed Abraham Lincoln. And not only did Karl Marx endorse Abraham Lincoln, but he did not endorse the far-left candidate, right? At that election, in 1864, the Democrats were running on a platform of ending the Civil War, peace with the South. They wanted to end the Civil War and allow the South to secede. Lincoln ran on a platform of don't change horses midstream. Now is not the time for a new president. Let me finish the war. And there was the Radical Democratic Party, it was called, or the Free Soilers. And they ran on a platform of Lincoln wasn't fighting the war hard enough. And they wanted, all kinds of things, land redistribution, arming, former slaves, etc. And you'll note that Karl Marx, even though the Radical Democratic Party, even though the Free Soilers were more in line with what Karl Marx believed, Karl Marx did not endorse the Free Soilers. He did not endorse the Radical Democratic Party. Karl Marx endorsed the Republican Party. And why did he do that? Because he knew that the Radical Democratic Party had no chance of actually winning. They were a third party. And that the Democrats, who wanted to end the Civil War and allow slavery to continue, were the main enemy. And that Lincoln, even though he was reluctant to do it, was leading the Second American Revolution, a mobilization to smash the Southern slaveocracy. So on that basis, Karl Marx endorsed Abraham Lincoln, a Republican. There's nothing wrong with entering an alliance. Sometimes you might endorse a Democrat like Roosevelt or a Republican like Lincoln. Sometimes you might endorse a third party like Henry Wallace. Sometimes you might run communist candidates for office. Sometimes you might enter an alliance with an anti-imperialist group or a peace movement or a labor candidate. Sometimes you might join an existing non-revolutionary labor union and work within it. Sometimes you might be forming a communist-led labor union. Sometimes you might be organizing protests that are led by communists. And sometimes you might be joining protests that are led by liberals in order to push a communist message within them. Tactics change. Alliances are made. That's just the nature of politics. Mao aligned with Chiang Kai-shek in order to defeat the Japanese invaders. But then, throughout that war, Mao did not lose his agency. He did not become an agent of Chiang Kai-shek. He aligned with Chiang Kai-shek, and through that alliance was able to build up the Chinese Communist Party so strong that after the war he could defeat Chiang Kai-shek. right? That, that Lenin told the communists of Britain, he said that they should endorse the Labor Party, they should support the Labor Party, but in doing so, they would be supporting it the way a noose supports a hanged man. They would support the Labor Party in order to destroy the Labor Party. That they would support the Labor Party amid this witch hunt, this Red Scare, this McCarthyite campaign against the Labor Party, because it was a nominally socialist party, and because there were efforts to suppress it. The communists in Britain would support the Labor Party so they could reach the average working class people who supported the Labor Party and win them to become communists. They would support the Labor Party in order to destroy the Labor Party. Tactics are constantly changing. Constantly changing. Lenin says that if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics also change in 24 hours. Tactics are constantly changing. There is no set revolutionary tactic. There is no permanent way to operate. Sometimes you might fight the Social Democrats. Sometimes you might align with the Social Democrats. Sometimes you might fight the liberal bourgeoisie. Sometimes you might align with the liberal bourgeoisie against fascism. Sometimes you might align with the conservatives because it's better to have them than to have the liberal bourgeoisie. Sometimes you don't align with any and you operate independently in the name of communism. There are different tactics in different circumstances. Tactics are not a law. They're not a moral question. There is no sacred tactic that one must carry out at all times. That is an illusion. Tactics are constantly in flux, constantly changing. But what doesn't change is that you are never losing your agency. Your agenda and your ability to attempt to carry out your agenda should never be up for negotiation, should never be up for grabs. When you abandon your own agenda, when you become a functionary in the agenda of bigger forces, that is when you cease to be a revolutionary. And that is what these internet grifters are. These bread tubers, they may speak in the name of socialism, they may speak in the name of Marxism, but everything they do, if you look at the way they operate, everything they do is about how can we convince people that are interested in socialism and communism to be functionaries of the Democrats. There is a cringeworthy live stream by Jabba the Vosh where he has all these quotes from Marx and from Lenin and from Mao, quotes he does not understand, quotes that are completely taken out of context, he's reading all of them off to convince you that you should support Joe Biden. And it's cringeworthy because he does not know the concept. He does not know the context. He does not know what these quotes mean. He does not know the nature of the debates that are happening. He simply knows that somebody handed him a list of quotes to read on his live stream to argue that that means you should support the Democrats. And that is how they operate. They get their marching orders from the Democratic Party. Their job is not to promote socialism. Their job is not to promote revolutionary Marxism. Their job is to convince people who are already interested in revolutionary Marxism and interested in socialism that their job is to defend the liberal order from the right wing. ContraPoints has this idiotic video, How to Spot a Fascist, all about how the problem isn't capitalism. No. The problem is that there's this secret conspiracy of white nationalists who have infiltrated the government, and our job is to go around exposing them. And you look at this video, and it's like, not only is it incorrect, right? There's not a secret conspiracy of white nationalists. The white nationalists that do exist are useful idiots for the Donald Trump wing of American capital. Yeah, sure, there's an interest in fascist ideology and such, but the white nationalists who exist, they're not, in the government influencing power. It's the opposite. Much like the liberals manipulate and use the left to serve their ends, the conservatives manipulate the far right in order to serve their ends. But you watch this video, and it's hilarious, because based on that video, no conservatives could ever exist, right? Sure, I believe a quote from the video, she says, I'm not a fascist is exactly what a fascist would say. But if someone uses a word like Western civilization, if someone does this, if someone does that, if they do a hand gesture, if they use they're clearly a fascist. You watch this, it's like there's no conservatives in America. They're all just secretly part of this fascist conspiracy, just saying they're not. Right? And in fact, there's no tankies in this world. Right? I mean, we're all just secret fascists. Even though we admire the people who just defeated Hitler, we admire, the people who created the civil rights movement. We admire the people who supported the Black Panthers, and I mean, apparently we're all secretly part of this, right? And basically, you watch the video. Anyone who does not repeat the standard Democratic Party line is secretly a fascist, and your job as a communist is not to actually promote communism, definitely not to support anti-imperialist states, God forbid. Your job is to simply go around saying fascist, 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 fascist at random people and looking like an idiot. Folks, most people in the United States who oppose gay marriage oppose it because they're religious. Their religion opposes gay marriage, they're against it, right? Not because they're fascists. It's just that's their belief. They have religious beliefs that oppose abortion, oppose gay marriage. Most people in the United States who, are racist are not fascists. Most people in the United States, I would argue, harbor some kind of religious bigotry or ethnic bigotry, right? We all do. It's subconscious. It's not like these people sit around and are all Klan members, but most people in the United States, look, we all struggle with it, especially all of us white people. Most people in the United States hold some level of racial prejudice. However, does that make them all secretly part of this, Ku Klux Klan conspiracy? Of course not. Of course not. There are many people who have racist views. There are many people who've been taken in by anti-immigrant demagogy and taught to believe that immigrants are the reason we're having problems. And again, are all those people part of a secret Ku Klux Klan conspiracy? No, right? But this is a delusion. This is a total delusion. Biggest takeaway from Mao. All right. Biggest takeaway from Mao. Apply Mao today. No, and the grifters, if you want to know who the grifters are the ones that feel it is their job to work within a bigger liberal machine, that feel that it is their job to operate within a liberal machine, that have given up their agency. They say what liberals and people oriented by the liberals want to hear. They don't tell their audience what it needs to hear. They tell their audience what their audience wants to hear. They don't tell their audience things they don't know. They tell the audience things that they already know. And they have given up their agency. They function simply as cogs in a liberal machine who just happen to claim that they are socialists and communists. People ask me, Caleb, why do you make videos with names like socialist billionaires? Why do you write books like Getting Rich Without Capitalism? Why do you do that? Because there are millions of American working class people who have worked very, very hard to get a house, to get a car, to take care of their kids, to raise their living standards. And what they have been told is that communists want to take all of that away from them. Furthermore, Michael Hudson, there is a widespread belief among the working class that communists are opposed to wealth, that we do not want people to be wealthy. We want people to be poorer. We want to decrease living standards. That needs to be combated. The idea that we want people to be poor must be refuted. The idea that socialism makes people poorer, which is what we've been told, and again, millions of working class people have been convinced. They say, look at Venezuela, it's poorer than the United States. Why? Because they don't believe in wealth. They believe in communism. They don't believe in capitalism. Capitalism is making people rich. Venezuela doesn't want to be rich. They're against capitalism. We have to refute all of this. We have to teach actual scientific socialism. Scientific socialism teaches that the means of production under capitalism function according to profits. And as a result, poverty and abundance walk hand in hand. Under capitalism, people become homeless because there are too many houses. Under capitalism, people go hungry because there's too much food. I've explained many times the problem of overproduction. The coal miner's riddle. The little boy is cold, and he says to his father, "Why can't we turn the stove on with some coal?" The father says, we can't afford any coal. We don't have any money. The little boy says, "Why don't we have any money, Dad?" The father says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine." The little boy says, "Why did you lose your job at the coal mine, Daddy?" He says, "Because there is too much coal." That is capitalism. Under capitalism, abundance creates poverty. Why did the U.S. economy crash in 2008? Do you remember that? The financial crisis of 2008? The housing bubble burst. What did the housing bubble burst mean? It meant Americans couldn't afford to keep buying houses. Thank you, Nicholas. I appreciate it. Americans couldn't afford to keep buying houses. And the easy credit that had been legalized by Alan Greenspan to keep people buying houses had dried up. People became homeless in 2008 because there were too many houses. Our economy crashed because there were too many houses. People could not afford to buy the houses that were being produced. The rate of home ownership purchasing in the United States went down, and as a result, the economy crashed. The economy crashed not because there weren't enough houses, because there were too many houses, and Americans couldn't afford to buy them. That's capitalism. And socialism overcomes this irrational problem, and thus creates the basis for wealth expansion to be unlimited. With a centrally planned economy, no more do poverty and abundance walk hand in hand. People don't get poorer because more stuff is created. In fact, it's the opposite. More stuff is created and people get wealthier. In a socialist society, self-driving cars would be amazing. Would be amazing. Because everyone who had a job driving a truck or driving a cab wouldn't have to do that, and they could do something else. And wealth would go up for society because those people that were doing that would no longer have to do it. They could do other things. It's only because of capitalism that self-driving cars are a nightmare or a curse hanging over the U.S. economy. Why? Because under capitalism, you only live so long as you work, and you only work so long as your labor enriches capital. The economy is not rationally planned. We don't put people to work doing useful work. We put people to work doing things that make capitalists wealthier. And if the capitalist has a self-driving car and does not need to hire drivers, then people whose job it is to drive cars don't have a job anymore. And there is poverty. Under capitalism, technological abundance, technological advancement, abundance, expansion, efficient production creates greater poverty. Socialism eliminates that. So the goal of socialism is not to make people more poor, so it's fair. Gentrification. It's not the goal. That is not the goal, gentrification. The goal is to eradicate the irrationality so that wealth can vastly expand. The goal of socialism is not to take working class people's houses and cars away. The goal is to have a society where the wealth of all can greatly expand. The goal is not to cap human wealth at $1 billion and say no one can ever get wealthier than $1 billion. The goal is to have a society with so much wealth and so much prosperity and so much abundance that we can eventually get rid of the government and that the state itself can fade away and that the need for any regulation can fade away. People can just take what they need and do like what they want, do what they feel like doing, from each according to their own ability, to each according to their needs. That is Marxism. And because it is my job as a revolutionary not to tell people what they want to hear, but to tell them what they need to hear, to tell people what they do not know, right? They've been told socialists want to make everyone poorer, and I say, no, we don't. We want the opposite. They've been told socialism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And I say, no, it didn't. It actually had great successes in the Soviet Union and in China, right? People say, America's great because, capitalism is a great system. I say, no, it's not. Capitalism's destroying America. Right? People say, communism's anti-American. America's the whole idea of America is anti-communist. I say, no, it doesn't. Abraham Lincoln had a communist general in the Union Army. Roosevelt had an alliance with the Communist Party and the labor movement. There's a whole history of the Wobblies and socialists. Even Martin Luther King Jr. himself advocated socialism. No, it isn't. Right? People say, but communism is about redistribution of wealth. When my taxes go up, that's communism. I say, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. Taxation happens under every system. Socialism is when the banks, factories, and industries are forced to work in the interests of the people, not the profits of a few. I'm here to tell people what they don't know. I'm here to tell them something that they do not know. I'm not here to grift and just tell them what they want to hear, right? I am not here to just tell you what you want to hear. I am here to tell you what you need to know. And that doesn't simply apply to economics and scientific Marxism. I'm here to explain that socialism is about growth. I'm here to explain that capitalism holds back economic development. I'm here to explain that socialism is about expanding productive forces in society, I'm here to explain that socialism is not a progressive taxation program, that it's not starting a worker co-op in the woods, but it's a centrally planned economy. But beyond that, I am here to argue with you on an emotional level. I'm here to argue with you on an emotional level. Because the tone prevailing in left circles is a pessimistic tone. When they sit there with their microphone going, fuck this shit, fucking hell, motherfucker, they sit there cussing. They sit there being contemptuous. They sit there saying Americans are all Nazis and racists. And they sit there underlying all the bad ideology is pessimism. The belief that there is no future. The belief that we cannot get to a better tomorrow. The belief that the future is one of apocalypse. The future is one of destruction. The future is one of hopelessness. The future is one of chaos and death. We're facing an ecological crisis. We're facing riots and anarchy in the streets. This is an evil country founded on genocide, and it's going to go up in flames in some big, mass, chaotic, murderous. This is pessimism. It is a dark, sinister, pessimistic place that says, I'm angry, and I'm going to take out my anger on other people, and I'm going to take out my anger on myself. Folks, anger is externalized depression, and depression is internalized anger. Right? People who are depressed, depression flows from being angry at themselves, from not believing in themselves, from believing that they are worthless, from believing that they have failed, from believing that they are not good enough. And it is anger turned in at themselves. And anger is depression externalized at the world. When people are frustrated, when they feel like the world has screwed them over, the depression that they feel, the hopelessness and all that, the frustration comes out at the world in terms of anger. Rage and depression walk hand in hand. Mass murder and suicide walk hand in hand. Why do you think many of these mass shooters shoot themselves after they kill a bunch of people? Because it's the same thing, right? They hate themselves and they hate other people. Hating other people and hating yourself tends to walk hand in hand. Tends to walk hand in hand. Anger and depression. It's generally what you get from left-wing politics. Anger and depression. The world is going to shit. There is no hope. Everything's falling apart. We're all going to die. This is an evil country. This is an evil society. All the people who live in it are evil. And so therefore, fuck this shit. Give me some free stuff. Ugh, I'm mad. There's no hope. It's this adolescent, destructive pessimism. And I'm here to argue against not only the incorrect ideas about socialism, I am here to argue against these incorrect emotions, because ultimately these emotions will not lead anywhere good. We socialists need to be proud of ourselves. We socialists need to love our community. We need to love our neighbors. We need to love our family. We need to love our country and our community. And our socialism should be motivated not by a desire to enact our rage on the world, not on a desire to unload our resentments, but rather on a desire to bring people together, to start building and constructing, and to start building a society where people aren't left behind, where people aren't left without, where people aren't hungry and starving and homeless, but rather a society where the strength and creativity of human beings is unleashed to go to higher proportions than ever. When I say I want socialists to wear suits, and my deepest respect, if you can't afford a suit, I'm not shaming you for not being able to afford one. But, the reason that I tell socialists to wear suits is because if you look neat, if you look clean, if you look respectable, you're showing love for yourself, but you're also saying to people, I take myself seriously. I consider myself to be somebody who could someday be the president, could someday be the leader of a mass organization, someday be a member of city council, someday be a member of the Congress. I consider myself to be an important thinker. And just like the president wears a suit, just like the talking heads on TV wear a suit, I am going to wear a suit because I think that that's what I am. And I perceive socialism as a message that has the capability of building such a mass movement. When you see an anarchist out there in his ripped jeans and his tattoos and he hasn't showered in a week, what he's saying is, I don't believe in myself. I'm mad. I'm having an adolescent temper tantrum. I'm mad at the world. I want everyone to know how mad I am at the world. I want people to see how mad I am about my favorite political cause, but I don't take myself seriously. That's what they're saying. And it goes along with that anger and with that depression and with that hopelessness. They all walk hand in hand. I don't know who that person is. I just don't know the name. I'll have to look him up. Max Alge. I'll have to look him up. But it all walks hand in hand. All walks hand in hand. Right? Suit socialism. Constructive socialism. The city building tendency. This is a different brand of socialism. It's anti-imperialist. It's serious. But it's constructive, not destructive. It's based on love and community and optimism, not pessimism. And that's what we need. And that's why I'm building the Center for Political Innovation. Folks, I'm so happy. I got 250 of these in the mail. Ain't that nice? Lovely, lovely stuff. Lovely stuff. I couldn't be happier. Couldn't be happier. This is beautiful. Beautiful stuff. We're moving ahead. All right, we've got our manual. We've got some meetups happening around the country the next couple months. And I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that by the fall we'll be able to start having public conferences around the country. We are going to build a constructive socialist movement. We are going to build an educational community about real socialism. We are going to save socialism so that socialism can save America. We're going to do it. I have no question, no doubt that we're going to do it. I'm excited about a lot of the developments that are happening right now. But at the end of the day, no one's going to do it for us. No one's going to do it for us. And look, when they look at us doing it, when they look about how frustrating it might be, how confused we are, and how we run one way and then we run another way, they might look on and it might be just like that peasant up on the hill. He was moving his arms around, and they say, well, that peasant, he's crazy. What is he doing up there on the hill? But, as Lenin told us, that peasant up there on the hill wasn't having an epileptic fit. He wasn't directing an invisible orchestra. He wasn't losing his mind. He was moving his arms around because he was sharpening a knife. And that is what we, the Center for Political Innovation, we constructive socialists, we city builders, that's what we're doing. We are sharpening our knives. We are sharpening our knives so that we can tear this system down and build a whole new country where the banks, factories, and major industries and centers of economic power are organized to serve the people, and hunger and unemployment and poverty are eliminated, and human creativity and human potential is unleashed to higher levels than ever, where we can join arm in arm with our friends in China, with our friends in Russia, with our friends in Venezuela and Cuba and other countries around the world, where growth is unlimited. And the future looks brighter and brighter every day. That's what we're doing here. And you have all been an essential part of that conversation. And we've been growing, we've been expanding. Our community just keeps getting larger and larger. So I want to thank you all for being part of it. Join our efforts. Be part of these efforts. The world looks very bad right now. But this is only because we are in the last days of empire. It is darkest before dawn. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. And on that note, folks, that concludes my opening remarks. So now we will do our roll call. I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us today? Names and locations. Names and locations. Arturo in Alaska, Nate in Chicago, Rafael in Brazil, East Germany, West Palm Beach, Joey from McKees, Toronto, Turtle Island, Cleveland, Pirate Alex, Billy Kane from Gateshead, England, Brazil, Cole from Calgary, West Palm Beach, Ireland, Albany, New York, Larry Chavista Chu, New York City, West Palm Beach, Tampa, Jason, Kenny from Malaysia, Calgary, Alberta, Clydebank, Escondido, California, Longshore, Toronto, Vallejo, California, Chris out in Salt Lake City. Welcome, Chris. Opening remarks, Warrington, UK, Nashville, Tristan in Maryland, Steve in Southwest Michigan, Valencia, California, Michigan, John in Houston, Sweden, Joshua Tree, California, Kinky, Max the Sax in Beltway, Texas, very good, Northern Virginia, Tony in Oregon Coast, Brad in St. Louis, Kieran from San Diego, Los Angeles, San Miguel, Ramiro in East LA, very good, Queensland, Australia, Anthony in Detroit, Ivan in Croatia, Montreal, Chaya, JT24 out in Mississippi, very, very good, Zach outside of Walmart in Seattle, Mohsen from Iran, Michael in Ithaca, New York. I'm going to make you a mod, Michael. You are now a mod. Right? There you go. Tom in Minneapolis. Very good. Muskville in Mars. Zachariah. A Better America. Joanne in the Netherlands. Joanne in the Netherlands. I think I'll make you a mod also, Joanne. I'm just adding mods like crazy. Isn't that great? Moscow Mills, Missouri. T. Comrade Wu in China. Shout out to you, Comrade Wu. Adelaide, Australia. Janos Redcat in Switzerland. Oakland, Balthazar. Monroe, New York, Auckland, New Zealand, Longview, Washington, with my wife, Marilyn. Welcome, welcome, Quinn. Nate from Pano, Sydney, Australia, Planet Mars, New Hampshire, Max. Tim Stacy in Kentucky. Naples, Florida, Harold Sullivan, Coba, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Ohio, Jenny Lynn, very good. Pomona, California. Mitchell from the Netherlands, welcome. Canada's Native Reserves and Apartheid System. All right, well, Canada Native, right? I think they call them First Nations people in Canada, right? All right, Leipzig, East Germany, Etatist is with us. Very, very good. Glad you're here, Etatist. Very, very good. Pouring some more unnamed diet beverage. Can't drink too much of it. Got to sleep tonight, right? Branson, Missouri. Congrats to the new mods, says JT24. Yeah, right, there you go. There you go. Anybody else? Anybody else? Names and locations, and then we'll start hammering away at these super chats. Hammering away, hammering away. Brazil, Chicago. There you go. There you go. All right. Okay. Right. All right. Okay. Next question. So the first question was similarities between Browder and Trotsky. I don't see them as similar figures, honestly. I mean, you can argue that Earl Browder was a traitor to Marxism, which he was. You can argue that Trotsky was a traitor to Marxism, which he was. But aside from that, they're quite different people. Leon Trotsky was from a middle-class Ukrainian family. They were Jewish. So they faced anti-Semitism, which was a huge problem in Tsarist Russia. Trotsky first joined the Narodnik movement. He eventually became a Marxist. He refused to join the Bolsheviks, but he had his own following. He was a well-known Marxist speaker and writer, a very good, speaker and agitator. He spent most of his life in exile in London and Vienna and New York City. Eventually, he went back to Russia, joined the Bolsheviks like a month before the Russian Revolution. A couple months before the Russian Revolution, July of 1917, was always kind of causing problems, eventually had his falling out with the Soviet Union, and went around, he was involved in the early years of the Soviet Union, eventually had his falling out, and in exile built kind of an anti-communist grouping, of people who claimed they were the true inheritors of Lenin's legacy, and that Stalin was an evil dictator and repeated anti-communist lies. Trotsky is this kind of middle-class speaker, writer, intellectual, very popular in intellectual circles throughout the West and enamored with the West. I critique his theory of the permanent revolution. I critique his anti-populism and how a lot of his teachings are, rooted in the revolutionary intelligentsia and also rooted in the, not just the revolutionary intelligentsia, but also the teachings of Marx, kind of holding on to some of the Eurocentrism in Marx. But that's not Earl Browder. Earl Browder, on the other hand, Earl Browder is a low-income person from Kansas. He's from a very poor family in Kansas. When he was a child, Eugene Debs came to the small part of Kansas where he lived and gave a speech. And, the young, teenage Earl Browder was very moved by it, as was his brother, as was his father. They were big fans of Eugene Debs. Then when World War I happened, Earl Browder and his brothers refused to fight in World War I. So they went to federal prison for resisting the draft. So Earl Browder went to federal prison, and back then, as weird as this sounded, right, state prisons were, were pretty awful back then. And federal prison was also pretty awful. But back then, very few people went to federal prison. And because he went to federal prison had more opportunities. I haven't seen that Vijay Prashad work. I'll have to check it out. Federal prison had more opportunities. So Earl Browder was in federal prison, and, he was in federal prison. And in federal prison, he got an accounting degree, and he learned to play the flute. And he came out of federal prison with the ability to be an accountant. And he was still a communist. So he joined the Communist Party. He worked closely with William Z. Foster. He was William Z. Foster's secretary. He supported himself by being an accountant. He worked in the William Z. Foster faction of the Communist Party. When William Z. Foster had a heart attack during his presidential campaign, Earl Browder stepped up to be the leader of the Communist Party, and he watered down what the Communist Party was about. He watered down the revolutionary side of Marxism. He pandered to liberal, middle-class, anti-fascist elements. He was really into the Popular Front. During World War II, he dissolved the Communist Party, changed its name to the Communist Political Association. And then when World War II came to an end and the Cold War got started, Earl Browder refused to reverse that policy, and he opposed restarting the Communist Party, and he opposed, anti-imperialism, and so he was expelled from the Communist Party. And that's Earl Browder, right? Earl Browder was a moderate, he was a corrupt, kind of ruthless individual, and ultimately he sold out Marxism. He made a deal with the liberals, and when the Cold War got going, he refused to back down from that. That's Earl Browder, Islamic liberation theology. That's Earl Browder. Totally different than Trotsky. Earl Browder is probably, Trotsky is very comparable to your kind of middle-class, hippie, rich kid who gets into communism. That's Trotsky. Your urban hipster revolutionary dude, who wants to tear shit down, and nowadays they're running around in the Guy Fawkes mask, etc. That's Trotsky. Earl Browder is your local corrupt union boss, right? He's, a sellout, he's your local corrupt union boss. He's your corrupt, crooked local politician, machine boss, kind of, yeah. Earl Browder was a communist who got some good attention from the liberals, and in exchange for that, watered down what it meant to be a communist and dissolved the Communist Party. That's Earl Browder. And, the weird thing is that if Earl Browder had just not been such a jackass, we would not be talking about him right now. When the Cold War started after World War II, all Earl Browder had to do, was change. All he had to do was say, oopsie daisy, all right, and go along with the reformation of the Communist Party, right? And everything would have been forgiven, right? And he probably would have been the leader of American communism in the Cold War. But he was so dedicated to his belief that U.S. imperialism was no longer reactionary, his belief that you shouldn't have an actual Communist Party, you should just have a political association, his belief that strikes should not continue, his belief that the Democrats were good guys. He was so dedicated to his, distortion of Marxism that when the Cold War got going, he wouldn't drop it. Trotskyism in China, very good question. And so based on that, Earl Browder eventually got booted out of the Communist Party. He gave a series of lectures at what's it called? At Rutgers University, Marx and America. He wrote a series of pamphlets, after he was kicked out of the Communist Party, and he became the Soviet Union's book dealer. He was in charge of distributing Soviet books. On behalf of the Soviet embassy in the United States, he became their book dealer. And he made quite a bit of money off of that, actually. The Browder family has quite a bit of money because Earl Browder was the Soviet Union's book dealer. He became a registered foreign agent who sold the Soviet Union's books. Best books by Stalin. All right. That's Earl Browder. Totally different than Trotsky. It's kind of the opposite, right? Trotsky is so into the revolutionary middle class stuff that at the end of the day, he can't be associated with the existing socialist state, right? He can't build real alliances. He's all about, revolutionary chaos. Earl Browder is kind of the opposite extreme. Earl Browder is so into the alliances and the political machine that he loses all that's revolutionary. They're actually kind of two extremes. Earl Browder is the example of a reformist organizer, and Trotsky is the example of a revolutionary middle class extremist. They're two opposite poles, you could argue. So there you go. All right, natural rights. Well, look, folks, human rights are good, right? When people have more freedom, that's good. When people have more freedoms, and that applies to economic rights. When people have more houses and more access to housing and jobs, that's a good thing. But rights are, by definition, things that exist in the context of human society. And rights change based on the economic system. Under feudalism, people did not have the same level of rights they have under capitalism. And in capitalism, people don't have the same level of rights they have in socialism, right? And under slavery, people, there were all these people called slaves that had absolutely no rights whatsoever. So the idea that there is one set of quote-unquote natural rights that exist eternally, I don't buy it. I'm sorry, because throughout human history, we have had different systems and different rights. And this is one of the flaws in, American ideology or American thinking, right? The stuff that we're kind of spoon-fed in the United States is this belief that everyone, everywhere in the world, should have the exact same level of freedom that we have in the United States at this time. All right, NATO and Five Eyes, white supremacist, right? And I'm sorry, but that's just not, that's not going to work. Look, societies that are under much greater threat, that face different circumstances, are just going to have different levels of rights. And you should obviously strive to maximize the level of freedom in all societies. But the idea that all societies should, out of moral imperative, have the exact same level of freedom the United States has at this time is not practical, right? Rights are based on material conditions. Rights are, so there you go. All right. Is the Taliban anti-imperialist? I don't particularly think so, no. The Taliban, they were overthrown. They were, I guess, they were accused of harboring Osama bin Laden, but at the end of the day, we understand that, part of the problem, the reason they were overthrown is they wouldn't go along with a pipeline. But, the role that they play in Afghanistan, it's questionable. I wouldn't put them as anti-imperialist. They have fought with the United States, but they've cooperated with the United States also. I don't know, I don't consider them to be constructing an economy in opposition to Western capitalism. They're an armed faction in Afghanistan at this point. I wouldn't use the word anti-imperialist to describe the Taliban. That's not to say that, that Afghans of all political persuasions don't have the right to defend their homeland from foreign invaders. No matter what their political beliefs. I don't care if you're a Taliban or a communist or a Buddhist or whatever. If you are in Afghanistan and your people feel they are unfairly occupied, you have the right to resist. And I don't make any political test on that. I don't say, oh, you have the right to resist as long as you agree with me. I don't do that, right? But the ideology of the Taliban doesn't seem to be anti-imperialist. And I think at this point, they are part of the U.S. propped-up government at this point. They're being brought into the U.S. propped-up government. They're an armed faction that has its own agenda, but I don't see them engaging in anti-imperialist activity. Very anti-China, very anti-Russia. So, yeah, they're working against the anti-imperialist countries. They are an armed faction in Afghanistan, one of many armed factions in Afghanistan at this time. All right. The people who say degrowth is not Malthusianism. Okay. Right? Malthusianism is the concept of overpopulation. In fact, the word overpopulation was invented by Robert Malthus. So anyone who's pushing the idea that there are too many people in the world is, by definition, a Malthusian. That's just fact, okay? Overpopulation is a word invented by Malthus. If you are going around talking about overpopulation, you are a Malthusian. So the degrowth movement that says there are too many people in the world is, by definition, Malthusian. Now, they want to reject the racism that comes with that ideology historically. Okay. They want to say that, oh no, we believe the West is just as guilty as the developing world. Okay. But at the end of the day, if your belief is that the problem in the world is there are too many people and we need to reduce the population and reduce consumption, that's Malthusianism. If you believe economic growth is bad, if you believe the goal needs to be reducing consumption, not changing consumption, not having more rational consumption, not changing the way we interact with our resources. But if you say the goal is to have less people, and have less consumption, you're Malthusian. That's what Malthusian economics is based on. The principle of overpopulation is the essay written by Robert Malthus, in which he argues that the French Revolution was caused by the fact that the food supply did not keep up with the population growth, and that the French Revolution was caused by overpopulation, and that you need to control the population to prevent things like the French Revolution from ever happening. And the term overpopulation was invented by Malthus. The belief that growth leads to social catastrophe, growth is bad, that is Malthusian. So if that's what you believe, you're Malthusian, my friend. The degrowthers, They may say we're not racist. Okay, I'm open to hearing that you're not racist. I don't think you're necessarily racist if you're a Malthusian. You may be open to saying you're, all kinds of things. But if you, again, environmentalism is not bad. Thinking that we need to change the way we operate with our resources, that's not bad. Pointing out the danger of climate change, not bad. But when you say growth is bad, that's Malthusianism, and it's not consistent with Marxian economics. All right. Long-term plans to expand the CPI beyond the USA. Well, there are people in Australia who want to form a CPI. There are people in Britain who want to form a CPI. All right, good books on Middle East history. They exist, yeah, I would like to see the CPI become a global trend. Right now it is U.S.-centered and U.S.-focused, but we have cooperated with people in many different countries. We've had speakers from Iran, we've had speakers from Australia, and speakers from India. And I'd like to see us, become a global trend, the city-building tendency. But at the end of the day, the ideas that we put out, the ideas that are in our manual, the We Are City Builders manual, they're not that, if you go to India and show them this book, they'll go, it's common sense, right? If you go to Russia and you meet with communists and you show them this book, they go, that's common sense. In the developing world, what we're saying is pretty gosh darn normal for leftists and Marxists. It's only in the West that our ideas are considered off, that we're like off-brand Marxists. We're like, abnormal for leftists. The way we talk for American Marxists and communists is pretty off. In the developing world, it's pretty standard. We sound like Bolivarians. We sound like socialism with Chinese characteristics. We sound like Baathists. We sound like, anti-imperialists. We sound like the communists in India. We sound like the communists in Vietnam. This is normal thinking, right? That socialism is about building a better country, building a better world, growth is good, suit socialism. This is normal. Communists wear suits in most of the world. In most of the world, what we say as the Center for Political Innovation is completely unoriginal and uninteresting. People would not generally be impressed. But in the West, where leftist politics has gone nuts, has gone completely nuts, what we're saying is actually quite unfamiliar to people, and that's why we have to say it. If China, Russia, and Iran were just counter-imperialists, would that fight hegemonic imperialists? Okay. Counter-imperialist. All right. Okay. Alrighty. Best pro-communist fictional films. That's a good question. There's a great film, a great anti-imperialist film called The Lion in the Desert, which is about Omar Mukhtar, the national liberation hero of Libya. And the film was actually created by the Libyan government in coordination with Hollywood. It's a great movie. The Lion in the Desert. Another great movie that's pro-communist. Let's see. Julia, starring Jane Fonda and Vanessa Redgrave. It's about the life of Lillian Hellman and her involvement with anti-Nazi resistance as a young communist activist during World War II. That's a very good movie. Julia. What's another good pro-communist movie? The North Star, made during World War II. Great movie. Mission to Moscow, made during World War II. Great movie. The Salt of the Earth was a movie made by the Hollywood 10, who were the blacklisted communist filmmakers during the McCarthy era. They made a movie about striking workers in Arizona, I believe, and it's called The Salt of the Earth. I would recommend that. Marlon Brando made a Marxist film called Burn. It's an amazing film about imperialism and national liberation struggles and the colonized people in revolt. Burn, starring Marlon Brando. That's a great movie. Try to think of a few more for you. V for Vendetta is not necessarily Marxist, but it's definitely anti-capitalist, I would say, and it strikes at, it's an anti-neocon film more than anything. They Live, John Carpenter, the man who made it, admitted it was an anti-capitalist film. And it's technically a sci-fi movie about space aliens, but it's, a subtle critique of capitalism. And he borrowed the aesthetics from communist groups in the early 80s. He was probably largely inspired by the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was very visible at that time. And, a lot of the scenes in the movie are almost like a fictionalization of the aesthetics of the RCP, the US RCP during the early 80s, and the way they presented themselves. They Live is a great movie. So yeah, there you go. Yeah, those are good movies, I would say. All right. One of the weirdest things is that, the Workers' World Party, they loved this movie called Heaven's Gate. And it's this movie called Heaven's Gate, which is a movie about poor people, Russian immigrants in Colorado. And Heaven's Gate, the Marxite communists think that is the greatest movie ever made. It's like a late 70s movie called Heaven's Gate. It's a Western about Eastern European Russian immigrants fighting against big landowners. And I tried to watch it, and it bored the hell out of me. I couldn't finish it, and it's largely considered to be one of the worst movies ever made. But I guess they dotted the I's and crossed the T's. They did and this is a problem with communists, is often communists will look at movies and they won't get the deeper message, right? They will look at movies from this kind of robotic perspective. Great example. There was a movie called Cold Mountain, right? And the movie Cold Mountain, it was about how the Confederacy was bad, right? It's about Confederate soldiers who are poor, who don't want to fight for the slave owners, so they run away to this place called Cold Mountain because they don't want to fight. And that's what it's about. It's about how the Confederacy was awful, and it was awful. I mean, it's an anti-Confederacy movie. But the Workers' World Party ran a review of it in their newspaper, saying it was a racist movie because it portrayed Confederate soldiers, missing the entire point of the movie. It's about Confederate soldiers who ran away, right? But that's the robotic tone. So of course they liked Heaven's Gate, one of the worst movies I've ever seen. They like it because it followed the rules of the party. I mean, it's off. I mean, and that's one of the problems with communists. Great example. The movie, there's a movie called Slumdog Millionaire. Slumdog Millionaire is right-wing, libertarian, pro-imperialist, capitalist propaganda. Right? You watch it. It is disgusting neoliberalism. It is an Ayn Rand masturbation. It is an awful movie. The message of the movie is basically the people of India are a bunch of savage barbarians, but luckily, free market capitalism can free them from their primitive barbaric ways. It is racist, it is pro-imperialist, pro-neoliberalism. It's an awful movie. There's a scene in the movie where it's about this poor kid who gets on, this low-income child who gets on the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire TV show in India and wins. And, it opens with he's getting all the questions right. So they're torturing him, torturing the great man for success. The government's torturing him because he's winning. And, there's just so many right-wing Ayn Rand themes in the movie. But the worst part of the movie, so he goes, at one point the little boy goes to the Taj Mahal and is pretending to be a tour guide. And he's not really a tour guide. And he's making a lot of money from tourists pretending to be a tour guide at the Taj Mahal. Right? So, of course, that's the whole Ayn Rand, he doesn't wait for the government to give him permission. He's just going out there and starting a business. Of course, the people at the Taj Mahal eventually catch him, and they grab him and they start beating him up, right? And then this American tourist couple runs over to him and rescues him from the Indians that are beating him up. And then the kid in the movie, I kid you not, he says to them, now you know what the real India is all about. And then this wealthy American tourist couple pulls a $20 bill out of their wallet and says, "Here, kid, Now you know what the real America is all about." It's pro-imperialist propaganda. It's racist. It's awful, right? There's a scene where, and his brother and him are standing there and they're looking out over this construction site. They're like, "Don't you remember when this was just a village?" And it's also supposed to be about how Western imperialism and Western neoliberal capitalism is developing India and saving it from its primitive, savage ways. It's just an awful free market movie. right? Slumdog Millionaire is like libertarian Ayn Rand propaganda, right? That the people of India are a bunch of barbaric, primitive, backward socialists who, but luckily free market capitalism will save them. It's just disgusting, right? And the fact that the kid who starred in it was homeless on Oscar night, right? It was made by these British libertarian guys, and the kid who starred in it was actually homeless when it won Best Picture, right? Because they don't care. They're out. Why should they pay this kid a decent wage for starring in their movie? I mean, it was awful in so many ways. And I remember at the time I was talking with some Marxists about this movie, and they would say, "Oh, it's a progressive film. It showed poor people in India." And I'd be like, yes, it showed poor people in India, and it said they're poor because of socialism, and the answer is capitalism. It was like they couldn't understand it, right? And this is my critique. A lot of these old boomers that are in communist groups, they have lost their critical thinking skills, right? It's like Cold Mountain is a movie that has Confederate soldiers, must be reactionary movie. It's like Slumdog Millionaire has poor people in India, must be progressive movie. It's like they have lost their ability to understand ideas and concepts, and they're in this robot. It is unbelievable. It is unbelievable to me, and you don't want to be that way. You want to understand concepts. Look, if you disagree with me about Slumdog Millionaire, I vehemently feel this way about Slumdog Millionaire. But you might disagree with me, but these old boomer leftists, Free State of Jones was one of the best movies I've ever seen. Free State of Jones, about, the low-income white workers who don't want to fight with the Confederacy, joining with the slaves to rise up against the Confederacy. That was an amazing movie. Progressive, right? But I'm sure there are a bunch of these old boomers who said, it is a movie about white people in the South, must be Ku Klux Klan propaganda. It's like, no, it's about, the Confederate soldiers quitting the Confederacy and joining with the slaves to fight against slavery. No, does not compute. It's it's pathetic. It's really pathetic. Don't lose your idea to understand movies, right? There are some very, very Marxist movies out there, and there are some very, very right-wing conservative movies out there at the end of the day, right? Hollywood has a diversity of messages, and honestly, I think, when you're dealing with science fiction and all of that, you can get away with stuff because you're not commenting on real world events, right? Messages can be vague, and there's a lot more progressive. There's a lot more progressive movies than you would think because they're not talking about things that are actually happening. You know what I mean? One movie that a lot of people liked that was awful was Across the Universe. I don't know if you saw Across the Universe. It was this movie where they were trying to make it was like a musical with Beatles music. And it was very anti-communist. It portrayed communists as deranged weathermen, sociopaths. Leftism is this, dangerous extremist. It was, even though they're singing Beatles songs, even though, yes, it did show, urban rebellions and how the police were vicious during urban rebellions, even though it did, have some nice scenes of anti-war rallies, it was an anti-communist, anti-leftist film. It was a retelling of the 1960s where the left were the evil ones. The left were these dangerous extremists. It was really an awful movie. But yeah, there you go. There you go. All right. Okay. Thoughts on Glasnost and Perestroika. Well, Glasnost was supposed to be political opening up, right? It was, Glasnost was the political reform. Perestroika was the economic reform. And the Soviet Union needed both, all right? It needed political reform and it needed economic reform. So the idea behind them, the concept of them is not inherently wrong, but both of them were administered in a way that destroyed the Soviet Union. That's just what happened. Perestroika led to eventually the economic dismantling of the Soviet Union. Glasnost led to the overthrow of the Communist Party. They could have had political reforms that strengthened socialism. They could have had economic reforms that strengthened socialism. They didn't do that. And part of the problem for that largely was that in the Soviet Union, they didn't have open debate, right? And this is again, a problem, right? During the Russian Revolution, they were invaded, the Russian Civil War invaded by 15 different countries, and eventually they outlawed all other parties except the Bolsheviks, and then they even outlawed factions. I don't know about those people. I just don't know enough about them. They outlawed factions within the Bolshevik Party, And so even within the Bolshevik Party, there were no factions. So publicly in the Soviet Union, everyone agreed. Right? The party line was unanimous. Every member of the Soviet Communist Party said exactly the same things. There was no debate, right? And every vote was unanimous. Everyone pretended to agree. But of course, people don't agree. Behind the scenes, there are political disagreements. But nobody knew where people could stand. There was one wing, it was clear in the 1970s and 80s that the system needed to change. But how should it change? And they didn't have an open debate about how it should change. And while publicly in the 70s and 80s, the Soviet Communist Party was putting out publicly just a vague kind of Marxist-Leninist line, behind closed doors you had two factions. On the one hand, you had, Gorbachev, and you had a westernized faction of people who thought basically the Soviet Union needed to transition to be like the West. And Gorbachev, he said they needed to abandon class struggle for universal human values, and they needed to basically become a social democratic welfare state like Europe. And then there was another faction that they called the conservative opposition that, again, in public were just, repeating Marxism, Leninism, but they were becoming, they admired Stalin, but they reinterpreted the Stalin era in terms of orthodox nationalism. They argued that Stalin was much like Ivan the Terrible. He was like many of the great czars. And they started to view the Stalin era and the achievements of the Soviet Union in the context of orthodox nationalism, Russian Orthodox traditionalism, the history of the Russian Empire, etc. So you had, behind closed doors, the party is kind of divided between westernized thinkers like Gorbachev and orthodox nationalist folks. That was big among the KGB. But publicly, everyone was just repeating this kind of vague Marxist-Leninist line. You couldn't have a public debate about how to fix the Soviet Union. And that was a problem. And if they, and at the end of the day, the westernized folks came into power and got manipulated by the United States and were convinced that the United States would let them become like Norway or Sweden, which they didn't. The United States economically demolished them. But Gorbachev and all of them generally believed that they could transition the Soviet Union to be like Norway or Sweden or France. That's what they thought they could do. And they didn't realize the United States would use the political crisis to just completely economically demolish the country, which they did. And the Orthodox, nationalist, conservative folks, they were outnumbered. So that's kind of what happened. And so, perestroika and glasnost, the concept of them is not wrong. They needed some kind of reform. The Soviet system was not going to last. But the way it was implemented is a problem. There needs to be more open debate, honestly. You need to have open debate. In Cuba, they do have much more open debate about how the Communist Party should function, and it's because of that that they have been able to adjust in ways that actually work. So there you go. All right. The Colombia protests, will they turn into a coup? I mean, it very well could happen. We could see a huge crackdown of the military or something. The people of Colombia are being shot down in the streets as they rise up against austerity and protest, and U.S. media is saying nothing about it because it's a U.S. regime. I mean, Colombia is the U.S.-aligned regime in South America, so they don't care about it. Same with Haiti. The people of Haiti are in revolt against austerity. You don't hear anything about it, right? But oh my God, anything in Venezuela, it's all because of socialism. Imagine if these kind of protests were happening because of socialism. They're happening in Venezuela or Nicaragua or Bolivia. It'd be all over the news. That's because, our Western media is propaganda and it's biased. They don't want us to know anything about what's happening in Colombia. All right. COVID conspiracy theories on the left. Yeah, I had somebody, block me. When I got my first COVID shot, I'm getting my second one pretty soon, Moderna. When I got my first COVID shot, I posted about it, and somebody who I've kind of respected, posted below it that I was lying and that this is part of the cover-up and all of this. I just blocked the person. That was unbelievable. And unfortunately, look, COVID-19 is real. Get vaccinated. Nothing wrong with getting vaccinated. I don't trust capitalist corporations. I know they're capable of doing bad things. But at the end of the day, people need to get vaccinated. I wish I could get the Sputnik V, the Russian vaccine. I wish I could get the Chinese vaccine. But I'm here in America, and we can't. And it drives me crazy that, okay, so we're not allowed to criticize, if you criticize the vaccines of the United States, you get your Facebook shut down. right? I mean, I don't have any criticism of those vaccines, but if I did, I would get my face, I couldn't tell it to you because I'd get my YouTube channel shut down. However, all over Western media, they criticize the Chinese vaccine, perfectly fine. They criticize Sputnik V, the Russian vaccine, that's totally fine. And that's called bias. And that's called bullshit. Either we should not be able to criticize any vaccine, or we should be able to criticize all of them, okay? That should be how it works, right? None of this, this idea that, if Russia and China do something, it must be met with skepticism. But if the Western capitalists do something, that's perfectly fine. I mean, if you can't see how much Western media is propaganda, I cannot help you. I mean, it annoys me. It genuinely annoys me how people can't see this, right? I will say to them, have you noticed that if you criticize Moderna or Pfizer's vaccine, you get your Facebook taken down, but even mainstream outlets are criticizing Sputnik V and the Russian vaccine and Chinese vaccine? I swear, and people will go, well, that's because Russia and China are bad and America is good. What's the problem? I mean, it's like some people, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right? You can't make him drink, so there you go. I'm sure just saying this, there are a number of people who, if I said this, I swear, there are probably people watching this right now, my detractors, who when I said everything I just said, would say, he's spreading conspiracy theories. And I would say, what conspiracy theories am I spreading? They'd say, well, you're saying that it's not okay to criticize. And I'd be like, that's true, isn't it? Yeah, but just kind of bringing it up is spreading conspiracy theories. All right? All right. Okay. Open debate. Benefit. CP. There you go. There you go. All right. Okay. And that's the annoying thing. It's like if you say anything that goes against the Western narrative, like I'm just disagreeing with the fact I'm allowed to criticize some vaccines but not others, and they're going to say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. They've got these people brainwashed that if you say anything that strays from what we all know, the narrative we all know, they say, well, that's propaganda, that can't be true. And it's like, no, there are problems in the world. I did reply to the obnoxious anarchist, that's the next super chat, and I said I would be happy to talk with him. And he says he's going to email me. So I plan on talking to the obnoxious anarchist when I get a chance. I'll happily talk to him. The fact that he was banned from Skippy the Bear's chat just for saying that I'm not a Nazi, I'm sure he vehemently disagrees with me on many issues, and that's okay. And I will happily talk to him. Yes, the answer is yes. All right. Is China the new vanguard of socialism? Well, China is certainly the biggest socialist country in the world in terms of population, in terms of economy. But I don't think China is trying to export their system. They have made vehemently clear they are not trying to export their system. They don't think that Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the four represents, Xi Jinping thought. They don't think these things are universal. They don't want to apply them in other countries. They're not the new Communist International, if that's what you mean. But they are the strongest socialist country in the world, the biggest socialist country in the world. So there you go. Haymarket and May Day. Well, the Haymarket events, that was in 1887. There was a strike for the 8-hour day. And there was a demonstration, and a bomb was thrown at some police officers, and a number of anarchists were framed up for that bombing and were given the death penalty. And they were innocent. They did not throw this bomb at the police officers, and they are and May Day, May 1st, is associated with the struggle for the 8-hour workday, the Haymarket events in Chicago. Haymarket Square is in Chicago. There's actually a monument to the police officer, who was killed. There's actually a monument in Haymarket Square to him, and that's considered to be the that's what May Day, May 1st, is based on. So there you go. All right. Best Soviet Marxist authors. My favorite Soviet book is Short Course, The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Short Course. That's very good. There's also a very good book, and I forget the name of the author, but it's called The Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, and it was like the Soviet textbook on Marxism, and I really enjoyed that. I learned a huge amount from that. My goodness, will this stop moving? There you go. All I really learned a lot from that book. There's a lot of good psychology texts that came from the Soviet Union. There's a lot of, there's a lot of, there's a number of old Soviet textbooks on ideology that are very good. There's a book called Petty Bourgeois Revisionism. It's got a section on anarchism, a section on Trotskyism, and a section on Maoism. It's great. That's a great book. There's a lot of really good old Soviet books. Progress Publishers, which was the English language publishing house of the Soviet Union and the United States. They published a lot of very good ideological Marxist texts over the years. All righty. Sino-Soviet response to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, look, at the time that it happened, they were sympathetic to it because they were fighting Japan and it was World War II, and they didn't want to piss off the United States, who was their ally. The Daily Worker newspaper, the Communist Party newspaper, they had a cartoon of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it was like, it had like, a boxer, and it said 1-2 punch, and one was Hiroshima, the other was Nagasaki. At the time of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan was a fascist, country that was fighting against the Soviet Union and China, and because of that, there was a lot of basically support for the United States taking that action. Now, we know later that it was militarily unnecessary, that the Japanese, wanted to surrender, and they got the same deal when they surrendered. Sorry, I'm trying to keep this camera from moving. They got the same deal when they surrendered before it as afterwards, so it was militarily unnecessary. That wasn't clear at the time that it happened. Plus, the Soviet Union and the United States were allies at that time, you have to remember, so they didn't want to, speak against each other or, fight against each other. But yeah, at the time, and the Communist Party did apologize for that position, actually. Later, I believe the cartoonist who made that cartoon, Robert Miner, was asked to resign from the Communist Party. I think he was later reinstated, but he was kind of punished for making that cartoon supporting Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it was militarily unnecessary. The USA was basically just demonstrating to the Soviet Union that they had the atomic bomb. It was militarily unnecessary. But the other thing that's interesting is Japanese communists generally don't talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki because the people in Japan who do talk about it tend to be far right-wing fascists, right? There are a lot of Japanese militarists who are viciously anti-Chinese, viciously anti-Korean, very racist, who talk about Japan being the victim during World War II, and they have demonstrations to commemorate Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So often, Japanese communists will make a point of avoiding talking about it. We in the West, we talk about it as being militarily unnecessary, and that's right, we should talk about it. We should expose that crime. But a lot of Japanese communists don't feel comfortable discussing that, which I think is very interesting. All right. Who was the worst president? Ronald Reagan was the worst president, in my view. Ronald Reagan was an awful president. He was an awful human being, right? He was an actor who had actually been friends with many communists during World War II, but then after the war, he narked on them. He banned communists from the Actors Union. Anybody who wouldn't denounce all their communist friends, anyone who wouldn't denounce all their communist friends, World War II communist perspective movie, was banned from the Actors Union. When Ronald Reagan was governor of California, there was a ultra-left adventurist group called the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA, and they kidnapped the wealthy heiress Patty Hearst. And so this weird Maoist terrorist group kidnapped Patty Hearst, and they demanded that the Hearst family, that's William Randolph Hearst, it's the wealthy Hearst family, they give like $2 million of free food to poor people in California, right? As that was one of their ransom demands. So in San Francisco, free food was given to all kinds of poor people. So Ronald Reagan was governor of California at the time. And they asked Ronald Reagan what he thought about all these, poor people getting free food. And he said, "I hope there's an outbreak of botulism." I hope there's an outbreak of botulism. A whole bunch of poor people were getting free food, and Ronald Reagan hoped that they all died. Yeah, that's demented. I hope they all got food poisoning and died. That is nuts. What else? Ronald Reagan, he rose to power denouncing left-wing protesters at Berkeley. That was his whole thing, as he made a show I mean, he went from being the head of the actors union and purging, anyone who wouldn't denounce the communists and go along with McCarthyism in the actors union. He was hired by General Electric, the military contractor, as their corporate spokesperson. What else did Ronald Reagan do? He made like a vinyl record about why national health care was a disaster because it would lead to full communism. It's the most silly thing you ever listen to. He's like, if the government runs the hospitals, they'll say where the hospitals have to be. And next, they'll say where the schools have to be in relation to those hospitals. And then after that, they'll say where your house has to be. And if we have national health care, pretty soon we'll have full communism. Bum, bum, bum. It's the stupidest thing you ever heard. But it was this vinyl record that the American Medical Association, was sending out everywhere, saying that if we have national health care, if we have, socialized medicine, we're going to have full communism in the United States. I mean, it was ridiculous. He was an anti-communist propagandist. He was a dumb actor. He wasn't very smart. You watch his broadcasts, he looks like a cowboy. The communists are coming for us now. I am Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, and why, we're going to fight the communists. Yes, we are. Win one for the Gipper. Yes, I'm going to back the terrorists in Nicaragua. I'm going to arm them to fight the Sandinistas. I mean, Ronald Reagan was an awful human being. In so many ways, he was an awful human being. Now, it's important to point out that in a lot of ways, he did represent kind of an uprising by the military-industrial complex against the Carter folks, against the slow-growth Eastern establishment, right? That Carter had cut the military budget. Carter was into slow growth and Malthusianism. Ronald Reagan he figured out how to appeal to that American growth, that American optimism, right? And that's what people who like him always say. He made us proud of our country anymore. He made us proud of America. And he's got that ad, it's morning in America, right? And I talk about this in my video about Michael Crichton. And, Michael Crichton, Michael Crichton very much, he very much incarnated, I talk about the Reagan spirit, how Reagan appealed to that belief in growth. He had a lot of libertarians who supported him, Ronald Reagan, he was very much, he knew what he was doing. But ultimately, he was a reactionary. He very much, he was the neocon president. Neoconservatism technically started with Nixon, but it really got going with Ronald Reagan. He was the neocon president, and he did a lot of evil things. Not a good man. Not a good man in my book. Not a good man. He joked about nuclear war at one point. Supported Osama bin Laden to fight the Soviet Union. He supported the Contra drug-dealing terrorists in Nicaragua. Look at South and Central America right now. All the people who've died from drug gangs, all of that started with Reagan. He got the drug narco terrorists going to fight against socialism. So all these people pouring in for decades and decades after the 80s. The 80s was a long time ago, but still, the narco gangs are killing people and all of that. The body count of Ronald Reagan's arming of the Contra terrorists, the body count. It technically started with Carter, but it really escalated under Reagan. The body count is in the millions. They always give you these numbers. Communism killed a million people. The Contra policy, the policy of arming the paramilitaries in Colombia, and the policy of arming the Contras in Nicaragua and in El Salvador, and arming the drug gangs to fight communists. That policy has led to millions of deaths, and those deaths are continuing. It is a murderous policy. So there you go. All right, biggest takeaway from Mao and Mao Zedong thought. Well, the main thing to look at Mao is that Mao was a brilliant politician. He was a brilliant organizer. He knew how to organize people. He knew how to apply Marxism to China's conditions. And actually, if you really want to understand the brilliance of Mao, I recommend you read the essay that's in the very back of the City Builder's Manual. It's a very, very important essay. It's a transcribed speech by Mao. It's called Talk on the Question of Philosophy, 1964. And Mao is speaking to a group of university students, and he explains to them how he thinks in terms of dialectical materialism. And he tells his story of organizing peasants and how he would play dominoes with peasants in order to organize them and win them to communism. And he had this brilliant way of working with people. He was a mass organizer. He was a brilliant statesman, a brilliant politician. He knew how to build alliances with people. He knew how to strategically operate. He understood Chinese culture. And his heroes in this, he talks about Benjamin Franklin was a great inspiration on him. Abraham Lincoln was a big inspiration on him. He was a brilliant man who studied world leaders. Mao was not some kind of like barbarian ogre or something. Mao was a highly educated man. He had been a university librarian. He had been a high school principal. He was a brilliant organizer. And he understood China. He understood the countryside of China. He understood the urban centers of China. He understood China's history and culture. In fact, Mao's hero was the leader of the Taiping uprising, right? 30 years before Mao was born, there was a civil war led by peasants, led by a Christian socialist revolutionary, the Taiping uprising, trying to build the Taiping heavenly kingdom in China. Mao was very inspired by it. And so Mao was he was a genius. He's going to go down in history as one of the smartest human beings who ever lived. He's on the level of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. And understanding Mao's, concept of the mass line, from the masses to the masses, it's really important. Michael Hudson. Michael Hudson is a very important economist. He understands overproduction, underconsumption. He understands China and how China is working. He's a Marxian economist who, I've learned a lot from Michael Hudson over the years. There you go. Gentrification, how do we fight it? Outlaw real estate speculation, right? In New York City, I believe at one point they had a tax. If there was any unoccupied apartments, right? If you were a landlord and there was an unoccupied apartment in your building, you paid a fine for that. And so doing that kept the price of rent low because landlords were desperate to fill up their apartments, right? And so they would lower the prices. The problem that we have now is that in New York City, the reason the price of rent keeps rising, the reason gentrification is happening, is because nowadays a lot of landlords make money without anyone ever living in the building. They buy the building, they wait for the price to go up, they adjust it in some ways, the price goes up, and then they sell it, right? And no one has to ever live in their building. They can make millions of dollars without ever living in the building. And so as a result of that, the price of housing in urban areas continues to go up. Why? Because landlords have no incentive to actually have people live in the buildings. So if you were to impose a fine on landlords for empty housing units, make them pay a fine, so they were desperate to get people to live in their buildings, that would drive the price of rent down. And if you were to outlaw real estate speculation, right, and say that you can't, if you own a building, you have to own it for like at least 2 years. You can't flip it immediately, right? You can't buy a building and then sell it 2 days later. You have to keep it for 2 years or something like that. So you can't it's not like gambling. If you were to impose those measures, you could very much stop gentrification. And that's the problem. President Xi Jinping has implemented these policies in China, right? He has said, houses are for living in, not for speculation. And that's the problem, is under capitalism, right? The capitalist just wants to make a profit. And, the capitalists have figured out a way they can make profits from apartment buildings without anybody living in them. Well, that's not okay. That's a problem. Get rid of it. Outlaw speculation, force, landlords to actually have people live in their buildings, and you would stop gentrification tomorrow. All right, Canada's First Nations people, the native people of Canada, they've suffered horrendously. Their religion has been suppressed. Just like in the United States, they had the Indian schools where the kids were taken away from their parents to have their language beaten out of them and be forced to dress and talk like Westerner, like Europeans. Awful stuff, absolutely awful stuff. The Indigenous people of Canada, I support their right to self-determination. If they wanted to break away from Canada and have their own, territory, just like I would support the people of Quebec who would want to do that, I would support if the Indigenous groups of Canada want to have their own territories and separate from Canada. I support that. I support the right of any colonized or oppressed person to do that. All right. Islamic liberation theology. Well, Gaddafi had Islamic socialism. The Islamic Revolution of Iran is Shia Islam, and it's very much based on, you're on the list, okay? You're on the list with anarcho-primitivism. Calm down, all right? Calm down, all right? All right, Malthusian anarcho-primitivism. All right, you're on the list, calm down. All right, the Islamic Revolution of Iran, they raised the slogan, not capitalism, but Islam. That was very much, a big part of the Islamic Revolution was a rejection of capitalism. So there you go. And there's a lot of, Islamic liberation theology. It's different, though. There's different forms of it. Gaddafi's Kibism. There's Islamic elements in Baathism, even though Baathism is a secular ideology. There's the Shia revolutionary tradition. So there you go. I'm not a Muslim. I don't speak for any of that. All right, Malthusianism, is it anarcho-primitivism? Is anarcho-primitivism amped up Malthusianism? Kind of. I mean, it's against growth, so you could argue that. Largely, anarcho-primitivism is very much I believe it's, who was it? Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who had the concept of the noble savages. And it is a huge amount of projection onto indigenous people. It's projection onto indigenous people. It's this idea that, before the white man and before civilization, everything was beautiful among the indigenous people. There was no oppression, there was nothing. And if we could just get back to an indigenous society, all of our problems would be solved. And that's racism. And it's a form of racism. If you assume that, that indigenous people are, they're just magical people. I mean, it's not true. I mean, the Aztecs, they had slavery. They were basically the Roman Empire in Mexico, right? This idea that, it's a projection of like an idealized utopia onto indigenous populations. And it's this belief that if we could go back to like tribal hunter-gatherer civilization, everything would be perfect. And we have to get rid of technology in order to do it, because technology is what creates, it's nuts. It's nuts. And it's racist in a lot of ways. If you go to indigenous societies, you will find racism, you will find sexism, you will find all the things that anarcho-primitivists want to pretend aren't there. It's very problematic, and it's racist ultimately, right? And the idea that there's not oppression of women in indigenous societies, that's false. The idea there were no wars between indigenous societies, that's false. And I'm sure I'm going to get canceled by a bunch of crazy anarchists for saying this. But look, yes, hunter-gatherer societies were not capitalist, and they didn't have classes. That's true. They were more egalitarian, but the idea that they were heaven on earth is ridiculous. But if you project your, and people do this with the Amish, right? I mean, I'm from an area in Ohio where there's a lot of Amish. You would get these tourists who would come in, and they thought the Amish were like magical, because they didn't have technology. It's like, oh, these Amish, because they have no technology, they're good people, they're not corrupted by technology. I'm sorry, that ain't true. Amish, there's domestic violence. There's capitalistic rivalries between Amish people. There were hate crimes between Amish people. There was a group of Amish people who thought another group of Amish people were fakes, and so they went around cutting off their beards, and it was a hate crime in Ohio. No. This idea that technology is the cause of all of our problems, that is a very, very like weird middle class delusion. So there you go. All right. Trotskyism in China. Trotskyism was very big in China during the 1920s. And the reason for that is that in the 1920s, there was a debate in China about what the Communist Party should do. The Soviet Union and the majority faction said that they should align with the KMT nationalist movement in China. The Trotskyites said they should not align with the KMT nationalist movement in China, but they should instead organize independent labor unions. And the Trotskyite opposition in the Chinese Communist Party was very significant, and they were expelled and kicked out. So there was, yes, a big Trotskyist movement, and there was actually even up into the 60s, there was a Trotskyite thinker who was quoted by American Trotskyists who lived in China and offered like critical support to the Cultural Revolution and stuff. I think his name was like Peng Tushi or something like that, and he was like the Chinese Trotskyite. And there was a small Trotskyite element in China, even up into the 60s and 70s. I don't know if there is any now, but there was certainly, Trotskyism in China, yeah. So there you go. All right. Best books by Stalin. I got a lot out of Stalin's essay. It's a series of lectures Stalin gave called The Foundations of Leninism. That was pretty good. I got a lot out of that. I also got a lot out of, problems of socialism in the USSR, economic problems of socialism in the USSR. There's a lot of speeches and stuff by Stalin that you can, Stalin, is not like a theoretician on the level of Lenin or anything. He was just kind of putting Lenin's ideas into practice, managing the Soviet Union. Would you say that NATO and the Five Eyes are white supremacist? They don't espouse white supremacist ideology at this point. They are upholding the hegemony of the West, so you could say that in a way, but at the end of the day, they work very hard to try and, give the image they are multiracial and stuff. So I wouldn't use that word to describe them. You got to be careful, using the word white supremacist and all of that. Most people look at you and you think you're crazy. If I were to go around and say NATO is white supremacist, people would say, no, they're not. There's all these people of color in NATO. You're crazy. And, you might feel like as a leftist, I got them. But to most people, they just think you're crazy. So you want to be careful in how you use words like that. Good books on Middle Eastern history. Well, I learned a lot from Edward Said, wrote a very, very good book called Orientalism, which is about, the perception of Middle Eastern people and the racism of the West. There's also a very good book called Bush in Babylon by Tariq Ali, where he goes over the history of Arab nationalism and such. That's very good. What else? There's a lot that's been written, but there's a very good book by the Palestinian resistance. They wrote a book called Our Roots Are Still Alive, which was the story of the Palestinian struggle. I recommend that. You can find copies of that online. That's very good. So there you go. The idea that Russia and China are counter-imperialist, would that make them progressive? Not necessarily. I guess, there is the concept of revolutionary defeatism. So in theory, you should always be wanting to see the defeat of the imperialist homeland. But at the same time, Russia and China are not imperialist, number one. And if they were imperialist, in theory, they could be like an up-and-coming imperialist power that would be more aggressive, kind of like the Germans or whatever. But they're not imperialists. Imperialism is an economic system. It's not just a synonym for influence. It's not just a synonym for doing business. All right? There is an economic system called imperialism. That ain't Russia and China. All right. We're almost done here, folks. We're approaching the end. All right. Would open debate benefit the Chinese Communist Party? I don't know. I'm not in China. I can understand how some people might feel that it wouldn't, right? Because of, such a big country and so much confusion and trying to get everyone on the same page. And I trust the Chinese to figure out, how it would be the right thing to do. Maybe it would be necessary. Maybe it wouldn't. I don't know. I'm not trying to tell the Chinese how to run China, right? I'm glad they have been successful in building a socialist society, but I'm not here to tell them what policies they should and should not implement. Best World War II movies from a communist perspective: The North Star by Lillian Hellman and Mission to Moscow. Mission to Moscow is a great movie. It's about, U.S. Ambassador Davies and his experiences in the USSR. And The North Star is a movie from Hollywood from the 1940s, written by a communist named Lillian Hellman, about the Soviet people and the Ukrainian people fighting Nazi invaders. It's an amazing movie if you can get through the first 40 minutes, which are awful. After that, it's very exciting. Those are my advice. I'm going to cut it off here. Because I'm getting some texts and I think I need to contact somebody. So thanks for hanging out, everybody. Always a pleasure to interact. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.